It's all about looking at subconscious rules that we have or hold about ourselves that limit the success or growth of our art. I want to talk about something that I know I still struggle with personally as well, and that I know so many of you can think about yourselves or can come up in conversation in terms of assumptions people make about creatives as well. I know that I've said it before, just as kind of an excuse and a way to avoid dealing with numbers related to my art, that I often will just kind of immediately say without thinking, I'm just not a numbers person. And I have heard countless artists say that. Just the way that kind of everyday people might say, I can't draw a straight line or I only draw stick figures when they see that we're making art. I see so many artists be like, I'm just not a numbers person. If we have to talk about math and art, I'm out. And they want to run away in the other direction. And I think this is really limiting for us as creatives. Not only does talking about numbers empower us and make us feel more confident in our choices, we can really dig in and ask ourselves things like, do I want to sell my art? That's another underlying assumption that a lot of people have, is that their art is only worthwhile if they sell it. And again, I don't think that's true. I think art is important, full stop. Art is an important part of being a human being. We made art before we invented language. Art is important, but we don't feel permission to make it. And when we talk about making art with other people, talking about selling it becomes this one way to justify the fact that we're making this art. And yet we'll have this conversation like this and talk about it. But then if we actually talk about numbers, we get really scared, we shut down, we can get really confused. I have a perfect example of this myself recently. Here in Ottawa, I found quite a few kind of opportunities to either apply for shows, which is how I got my solo show. And as well, there's quite a few grant opportunities in Canada as a resident that I'm really excited to have an opportunity to apply for. Of course, lots of these grant opportunities require budgets. I heard all of this conversation in my head about I'm not a numbers person, I'm dumb at math, like I can't do this, says the girl who did calculus in high school. So I have to catch myself and go, you're not dumb at this. Maybe sometimes you get a little confused, but that doesn't mean that you're dumb, and that doesn't mean you're not capable of figuring out numbers. And something that with budgeting and grants you have to really think about, hi Jackie, is you can ask for help. So for example, one of the grants that I've applied for is called Articipate, and it's through, I think it's, oh man, I wish I had looked up the name first. It's one of the local Ottawa arts groups here, and they were so helpful. One of the women who's connected to the organization, she actually offered to call me. She called and gave me some feedback on the budget I had tried to set up because I didn't quite understand what they expected of me. And I immediately heard all this negative self-talk, and yet I walked through it and she was so helpful. So access and use these people to help you. So ask for help if you feel confused about numbers, but also just something simple like, if you're going to create a budget because you want to apply for a grant, they expect that your revenue and the money that you're spending, including your hours spent on an artwork, even out. So, for example, for that particular grant, I would possibly earn 1,000 Canadian dollars towards my art for the show. So other revenues, that's a revenue, right? So $1,000 has to be on the revenue side of earned money towards the show. But they also wanted to see things like projected sales from the show. So that means I need to think about how many artworks I have and what seems like a reasonable amount of art that I might sell. You don't assume you sell every artwork, but what's a reasonable amount of art that might sell? So I said, okay, let's say I earn maybe $2,000 from art sales. So that means my revenues total to $3,000. So that means my expenses, including the time that I spend as an artist on the work, has to add up to $3,000. And for me, for some reason, that felt like inauthentic or dishonest because I've already spent hundreds of hours on the show that I'm building towards. I've already spent lots of money, but they're only looking at what you're going to spend once you are accepted for the grant. because they don't retroactively pay for things. Most grants only pay for things that you have yet to spend money on. So you create a list of things like, I want to have food at the show. I want to be able to frame 3 artworks that I know I have to get framed, and that's about $200 in artwork. And so you list all these expenses, and then think about the hours you can still put into the show. And in Canada, there's something called CARFAC fees, C-A-R-F-A-C. And actually, if you're in the US or anywhere else, you could use the CARFAC listings to give you a sense of how much time, like what your hourly wage should be, things like that. And so I totaled up my expenses to equal the $3,000 that I said I was earning in revenue. So then I could send out that budget, and it was aligned with what they expect of me. Budgets always need that. They need everything to kind of match up. Even if, in truth, you're spending a lot more money and time on stuff, you need to be thinking about how you can show them that how you're going to use this money and where it's going to go. For me, there was so much internal self-judgment. Immediately that kind of negative self-talk, I'm dumb, I'm not good at numbers, I can't do this, I'm not smart. And I wonder how many artists avoid even trying to apply for a grant or a show where they have to show numbers because they're just intimidated or scared to try. And I want you guys to understand that the organizations that offer these grants, they often have wonderful supportive people who want to help you if you're confused. You can find resources online, and you can also sit down and ask yourself, do I want to be spending my time on this? Maybe art for me is meant to be only about play and exploration, and I'm going to give away my work at the end. And if that's what you want to do, and that's what your heart calls you to do, that's what you should do. But if we avoid thinking about numbers, and we avoid asking ourselves, how much money do we spend on making a work? How much of our time goes into it? So what would this artwork be worth to someone in terms of if it's reflecting the use of our time and the materials that we spend our money on? So for me, gold leaf is really expensive. That has to be something that I consider in the pricing of my art. We need to be thinking about these things so that we know, well, if we're going to price our art, what is aligned with that kind of pricing. And if we're going to sell it and we want to make it a business or a side hobby that pays for itself, what kind of money do we need to earn? These don't have to be scary things, and yet we make them scary. And it's almost like if we actually take the time to do these numbers, we might find out that we're a failure. We're never a failure if we choose to make art. And the only way, if you want to sell your art, you're going to get better at it, is if you look at those numbers and ask yourself questions and set goals by those numbers. So let's take a stand today and say, I am not going to be scared of my numbers anymore when it comes to my art. It could be a simple thing like trying to measure out a grid on your canvas and on your image reference. Sometimes people get confused when the grid image, your photograph reference, isn't perfectly lined up by inches or centimeters, figuring out how to make it proportional to a larger canvas. We can do these things. We're smart people. We have grit. We're willing to work through things and figure out why it's not working. And guess what? There's no shame in asking for help if you're confused. Not asking is, I think, prideful in some ways. We're afraid to show our weakness, And I want us to really ask ourselves about that. Like, why do we avoid numbers? Are they scary to us? What kind of associations do we have with them? And do they limit our technique because we're afraid to try a grid because of measurement? And I know for me, that's one of my big ones. Numbers. Numbers are big and scary for some reason. And so I have to say it out loud here and admit it, because that will help me move forward. And I still applied for that grant, and I had wonderful help from people who put themselves out there to help me, not because I actually had thought to ask, but because they knew this was a problem that sometimes artists have. So now I know it's okay to ask for help. I don't know why I needed permission or an example to see that, but I'm hoping this tells you too, it doesn't matter whether it's about technique or it's about money numbers because you're thinking about covering the expenses of your art, or you want to start selling it and earn money from it, or you're thinking about a show and you're trying to apply for a grant. You can do this. And if you feel fear come up because we're talking about numbers, remember you have a community, you have spaces where you can figure these things out. So I'd love to wrap up today by having you guys share in the comments below something about numbers that has been a belief that you've had, or a fear that maybe you didn't realize you had, but now that we've had this conversation, you're realizing is influencing your artist practice. And again, it could be about measuring things out. In an artwork, it could be technique based, or it could be about money numbers for applying for something like a grant and you've been too scared to try. Let's start owning those fears so that we can move forward with them. So comment and share those ideas below, those underlying fears or concerns or questions you have around numbers, so that we can start helping each other out and overcome them. And of course, if you benefit from today's video, please give it that thumbs up or heart so that more people can find out and share from the wealth of information that this community, all of you offer and support one another with. So thank you guys for being here. Artist Strong, Carrie here, signing off.